So hi, I'm Anthony Rose. I'm founder and CEO at SeedLegals. I used to head up BBC iPlayer. After I left the BBC, I built a startup, sold it, built another startup, sold it, invested in a few, got tired of paying lawyers, met my co-founder and started SeedLegals, so no one ever needs to go to law firms again. But what I'm here to talk about is the life of a startup and a startup founder, and maybe the lifestyle and how you go about picking the right things to spend the next few years of your life on. So I think it all starts with you having an idea. Ideas are cheap. Maybe you're going for a run and you have this idea, and I'll pick an idea of a GPS, Wi-Fi, bicycle lock that will tell you if your bike is stolen and where it is. So you're having a run and this idea comes to mind. And is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? And actually, as someone who does this a few times, I'm hugely amused because after I've sold a startup, I sort of hang out at home and think, I'll do another idea. Either that or I'll get a proper job, I'm not sure. And then my wife, as she goes off to work, says, so do you have an idea? And I go, no, I've just sold the business. We'll have an idea soon. And then a couple of weeks later, so, how's it going on the ideas? There's no rush. But just how those ideas coming along. It's like, well, I'm not sure. So the problem with having ideas is you don't really know when you've had a suitably good idea. And you can't scientifically going, I've got 48 hours to have a really great startup idea. So the beginning is all quite random. And how do you find something that you're going to be passionate about to spend much time on, and also something that makes sense? So people perceive when they have an idea that the real difficulty is going to be building it. But actually these days with cloud services and so on, I think the real difficulty is getting people to want what you've got, to cut through the noise on getting out so that people even hear of what you've got. Actually building something is quite easy. So at SeedLegals, I talk to quite a few startup founders every day and have spoken to many hundreds. And although every idea is different, I think there's a general formula. So over the next few minutes, let me try and take you through sort of that formula so that if you're a potential founder, you can try and cut through lots of noise to get to the answer, to get to success as efficiently and reliably as possible. So I like to think about a startup as maybe ripples in a pond. As a founder, you have an idea, and that you drop the stone in the pond, and now your goal is perhaps over 3 ripples, where each ripple is a funding round, that after 3 ripples, you either have enough, now the company's large enough and cash flow positive that you never need to raise again, or you're ready to sell the business. It's vibrant, someone's looking to buy the business. And your goal is over perhaps 3 funding rounds to raise each time enough to get you to the next step. And you're going to raise 3 to 5 times each time at 3 to 5 times the valuation. So my data, and on SeedLegals we've got huge amounts of data, says that founders put a median of about £26,000 of their own money into the business first, which ironically usually means you have to have sold the previous business to have the money to fund the next business, so you've got a problem getting started the first time round. And the reason is ideas are cheap. No one invests, or very rarely, just on a PowerPoint. So you need to put your own time and money in to develop something to the point that someone will invest in it. And now, over 3 rounds, the formula broadly is something like this. Founders put a bit of their own money in. Statistically, it's likely that there are 2 founders. Sometimes it's 1, sometimes 3, more likely 2. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Then you may raise £50,000 from friends and family, or £150,000 of angel investors offering them SEIS and EIS tax benefits. And if you don't know about SEIS and EIS, you should do some research. It fuels the UK startup ecosystem. Investors can claim back 50% or 30% later of their investments, and if your company goes bang, they can write off their investment, which means you can even talk to friends and family, and if it doesn't work out, they'll still invite you to Christmas dinner, later on. So Round one is either £50,000 from friends and family or maybe £150,000 from angel investors. Round two might be a seed round raising £500,000. And then round three might be a Series A round raising a couple of million or £1 million. So you can see each time you want to get to the next step. But let's go right back to the beginning where you've had this idea. And the first thing you need to do is work out really whether it's a good idea or not. And the problem is, what you do is you ask your friends, you ask your family, and you ask your mother. And of course, your mother says, of course it's a good idea. No idea what this GPS bicycle lock thing does, but my son is a genius. Of course it's a good idea. So the problem is, if you ask the wrong people or you ask the wrong questions, you'll get the wrong advice. And people will tell you, because they like you, they don't want to tell you it's a bad idea, or you've told them in a way that inspires them to say, imagine this amazing bicycle lock that if your bike starts, it will tell you instantly, never mind the battery only lasts, 2 hours and doesn't work under a bridge or in a parking lot or whatever it might be. So the first thing is to try to tease out whether it really is something that people want. And don't ask them, don't you think it's a brilliant idea? Instead, ask them, have you ever looked for such a product? And if they go, not really, that's a good cue that either it's so novel that no one's thought of it, or actually there's not really a real need. If they tell you, yes, I've searched for 3 of them, I've downloaded 2 are rubbish, 1 crashes, and the other one's too expensive, then you know you've got a price or a technical opportunity to do this. Now, there's an excellent book called The Mom Test, it's £10 on Amazon, that I highly recommend, and it's called The Mom Test because you ask your mother. And so that's really your first filter. So everything that I'm going to be talking about is ideas are cheap, endless numbers of ideas. One of them you're going to pick to spend some years of your life on. And the problem is, when you start, you can flip ideas in seconds. But once you've enticed people to leave their day jobs and join you on this mission, and investors to give you money, at some point you go, it's not such a good idea. No one really wants this. That's kind of stressful. So you want to try and validate that up front. The next thing, having now worked out it probably is a good idea, is to prototype it. And again, too often, and I've done this in the past, people start building it immediately. Oh, yeah, let's design this bicycle lock thing. So you hire developers, or you're a developer, and you start building it. The problem with building it, people perceive, particularly tech people, engineers, and I'm kind of one of those, that success is building stuff. But I've realized over the years that success is building less stuff. Building stuff is the failure to have something that people want without having to build it. If you can put it together with gaffer tape and a Zapier and a Trello and something else so that you have to build less stuff, at least in the early stages, that's better than getting to build stuff. So try to have something that people can use without building things. Now, of course, some things, you know the term MVP. When we started SeedLegals, the thought was, we kind of knew that startups would love a service where you don't need to go to lawyers. I knew, because I'd been around, that I could build such a thing. Between my business partner and myself, we knew we could fund it. So these are the key problems that most startups have. Can you fund it? Can you build it? Do people want it? But for me, the key question was, maybe investors would refuse to use it. Maybe each deal was so different that my trying to sort of formulate something in a standardized way just wouldn't work. So, of course, I can't give you sort of MVP legals. Oh, yeah, you'll beat up legals. Yeah, wing it and see. Wasn't really going to work. So one thing you may have heard is the fake it till you make it. And that is that you might have a website that looks like the real deal, but behind it, your team is manically doing stuff. So when we launched, people would go to our site and they'd go through all the questions and they'd enter the data. And instead of the machine generating all the documents, it was our chief legal officer manually doing it in Word, going, can you please make this automated? It's killing me. And but the quality was good, but you're doing it with humans until you can do it. So again, your goal is to try and provide a service before you've had to invest a huge amount in making it. So you can find what's called product market fit. So the next thing is about prototyping. Because once you've got your developers building stuff, if they've built it before they've asked people to test it, it's a high emotional cost, people telling you what you built is wrong, and a high actual cost. It's taken weeks or months to build stuff, and now people are telling you they don't want it. So your goal is to not build anything until you've had customers using it. And I'm a huge fan of customer-driven development at SeedLegals. The entire team, including me, constantly sees what our customers are asking. So we use Intercom, which is web chat, which I highly recommend, and it turns your website from something where people just go and interact with the computer into something that's a two-way interaction with your team. So if people come on SeedLegals and they go, how do I do X? I've got a support team that does it, but I will see it. Our CTO will see things. If people can't understand how to use something, the team are seeing what customers want. And I think that's really, really important. But before you've got lots of customers, you want to test. So you want to create mock-ups of your idea. Get a graphic designer before you've hired any developers. And for a very small amount of effort, you can build mock-ups and have people test them. And I'm a big fan of that testing. I try to test everything in that way. In fact, with SeedLegals domain name, one of the hardest problems, by the way, in a startup is figuring out a domain name. Everything's taken, or there are trademark issues. And I kept going, at 1 a.m. having this idea of a brilliant name. And then I'd go buy it on GoDaddy. And then I'd ask my team in the morning, they would tell me it sucks. So I must have bought like 20 names, and I thought there must be a better way to do it. So I wrote them all down on a piece of paper. I'm a big fan of user testing. And we're in a workspace, kind of WeWork type thing in London at the time. And so I printed them all out on a piece of paper, and I went around to the cafe in the building and said, if anyone comes by with one of these pieces of paper, there's a coffee on me, and I'll come around at the end of the day and pay you. And then I went to all the startups in the building and said, if you're looking for a service to help you with a funding round, which of these names might it be? And there was Clause.com, DocMotion, LexMarta, all sorts of super clever names. And people went through them and went, sounds scary. Don't know what you guys do. That sounds complicated. And then it got to SeedLegals, and someone said, I know what you guys do. And I thought they were so good, because I didn't even know what we were going to do. but the name seemed to describe it. But of course, I had tested on a particular audience, which is early-stage startups in a sort of WeWork-type building. Had I started with much later venture-backed companies, I may have got a different result. But even our name, I like to test. So using user feedback to test concepts before you build it is super important. So now comes, you validated the idea. Now you need to find a co-founder, maybe. And that's one of the hardest things. Finding team members, developers, is kind of hard. But when you hire employees, if you don't like them, you can fire them or they might leave. But a co-founder, you can't really split up. When you bring people on a mission, you kind of, yes, it may fail, but you want to do everything. The weight of responsibility is on your shoulders to make it a success. Again, you've inspired people to join you, and when things don't work out and customers aren't coming, or someone's got a problem, or the servers crash, or whatever it might be, in a large company, you can always turn to someone and go, dude, what's the answer? But there's no one to tell you the answer. So you have to own the responsibility, and you have to make decisions. And it's very useful to have a co-founder, because you can't really necessarily share with your team and go, dude, our customers are deserting us, what do we do? They're going to go, I don't know what you're going to do, but I know what I'm going to do, which is find another job. So you need someone as a confidant to share risk and rewards with, and that's a co-founder. And I think in a startup, there are broadly 3 roles. They might map to 1 or 2 or 3 people, but the roles are, number 1, the domain expert. Broadly, that's often the person whose idea it is. It might be the doctor who's got a cure for something or other because some family member, everyone's got a story, and you're the one who wants to solve that problem. The problem is that person may not be technically inclined. It might be a doctor who knows all about dialysis, but knows nothing about software development. So your next role is the person who's going to be in charge of building it and delivering it. And that's often the tech lead or CTO or the product person who understands what consumers want and can work with a team to deliver it. And the third role is more like the Mr. or Ms. Money or the CFO role, which is someone to make sure it's a vibrant, growing business which isn't going to run out of money. So if you, as a potential founder, look within and go, which one or more of these am I? And then look to surround yourself with partners who have the other roles. So for me, I'm a kind of tech product guy. I love turning an idea into reality. The money side of things and the accounting is kind of like you've got to do it, but it doesn't really turn me on. The domain expert, well, now with SeedLegals, it's very much me, but my background used to be video, and before that, audio, and then 3D graphics. So what landed me in, the legal tech space, and I realized the abstraction is that I just love and think I'm good at taking an idea and going through those steps to build something, test it, and deliver it. And it almost doesn't matter what it is. But of course, it's super important, and that's one of the hard things with finding an idea or hopping on as a co-founder with someone else with their idea, that you're super passionate. And that takes me to one of the next things, which is, are you the audience? So sometimes you have a pain point. You are the person riding the bicycle who's had their bicycle stolen, and now you want the bicycle lock. But sometimes you're a founder in a company doing something else. Maybe you're making the growing number of companies doing funeral bookings. The developers all in their 20s, the customers are probably in their 80s. And, how do you guess what the audience actually wants? And to be a proxy for your user yourself is so much more powerful than if you're not. So if you can try and pick something where you are the audience, that's great. And in fact, back in my BBC iPlayer days, in the early days of iPlayer, the problem space was really technical. The internet, the pipes were smaller than they are now. The iPlayer was going to crash the whole internet. The computers had much slower graphics cards. The bandwidth was less. The encoding took ages on those computers that we had at the time. And so the goal was to make video stream reliably and not buffer, and the graphic quality look good and so on. But then one day, the BBC did a survey and they actually said, who's the audience? And it turned out the audience was a sort of upper middle class white male, mid-40s or whatever. And they looked at me and went, dude, it's like you are our audience. But then, that was just the early days. But then the audience shifted and it went from Top Gear being number one to EastEnders or Waterloo Road being number one. And actually, I realized one day the domain, the problem space had shifted from a technical problem to recommendations, to content. And now the problem space even has moved on much further, which is Netflix and what is television and what are people looking to watch? And do they want to watch broadcast content at all? So actually what's interesting is at the early stages of a company, particularly if it's doing something novel, the problem space is very much technical, but you constantly have to reinvent yourselves lest you're too focused on delivering a technical solution and one day you wake up and found someone else has out-disrupted you. So I think that's it on the startup pieces. I'm now going to go on to, very quickly, some of the things to do on the legal side, given it's SeedLegals. So you've now got an idea. You found yourself a co-founder, you start on it. And there are a couple of things you need to do to make sure that you're investable and you don't screw up, basically. So thing number one, we find that about 10% of the time, founders split up. You find yourself a co-founder, all is well, but things take longer than you expect. You have creative differences. Somebody has to pay the bills and they leave. And typically what happens is you create a company, you make 100 shares, 50 shares each, and if your co-founder leaves with their 50 shares and no founder agreements in place, you're basically screwed. Because no investor is going to invest in the company where half the shares are owned by somebody who's not part of the company. Worse, the co-founder might have a dispute and say, actually, this is my idea, I own it. And then you're in the worst case, which is not only have you lost somebody, but you may not even be able to continue with what you thought was your idea because of a dispute. So as soon as this changes from a hobby, yeah, it doesn't matter if it works or not, we'll have another idea, into something that's serious, you should make sure you do a founder agreement that has founder share vesting. So if somebody leaves, they have to give back some fraction or all of their shares, depending how long they're with the company. Number two, that it has IP assignment, so all the intellectual property is assigned to the company. And that there are non-competes and non-solicitations, so the person doesn't leave and go, oh, I'm just going to start a competing company, which is a bit of a disaster. The next thing, very briefly, is on trademarks. So you might say, I have to trademark my name and so on. So trademarking is very valuable, but it's a double-edged sword. So a little while back, I invested in a startup, 3 students, and I said, we should trademark the name. So I immediately went to the ico.gov.uk, which is actually not a bad website, and for about £200 you can trademark a name. But the problem is, as soon as you trademark it, the government rights to, everyone else has got a phonetically similar trademark. And that then alerts other people who are forced to object. So if you don't look to trademark your name, you may get away with it. You probably will, at least until you get larger. But by looking to file a trademark, you immediately alert everyone else. And so you may find, perversely, that you're much better off not looking to file a trademark. But nonetheless, you should definitely do some research, which you can do at no cost, on the government website to see and do a sanity check. Trademarks are done by different verticals. So although Apple owns computers, you could probably get Apple combine harvesters, although I wouldn't try that with Apple. The next thing is patents. And obviously at a university, there's a lot of patentable technology. But in general, for software things, I think patents are a waste of time and money. I've got about 13 of them. It costs you probably about 20 or 30,000 pounds each. Finally, when you get it, it takes 3 to 5 years. You have a strike rate of about 1 in 3. So you start off going, it only costs a few £1,000s to start a thing. If you watch Dragon's Den and people come in and say, do you have a patent? Oh, yes, I've got a worldwide patent. No. They might have. It would cost hundreds of thousands. It would have taken years. It would have cost more than they're going to get from the dragons. It's unlikely. More likely, they filed a few patent applications, which is far from having a patent. And the problem is, and this comes down to ultimately, when I talk to founders, I like to see people who like to run it as a military operation, laser focused on making it a success. Because you have all these things that you could be doing. You might be thinking, I want to make a consumer product. But then I'm going to have data, and I'm going to use blockchain, and I'm going to have APIs. I'm going to sell data to businesses, and then businesses will have an interface. And when I see pitch decks with people doing all of these things, it's not a positive, it's a negative. And I think people think when they're pitching to investors that we have to do lots of different things. But if you're 50 people, great. But if you're 3 people, every different thing you're doing is spreading yourself wider. So you're doing each individual thing less well. And if you think about having competitors who are laser focused on something, then that is good. So to kind of wrap up, you've had an idea. You now want, with laser precision, to figure out how I'm going to get from there to success. And on the investment side, you're probably going to do it over a number of phases. On the product side, you're going to do it by validating. And I guess also on the product side, you're going to do it by deciding very carefully which things not to do. Because you're going to have people telling you, I wish it does X and I wish it does Y. And one of the problems is after you've launched your product, traction is probably never as good as you had hoped for. It's very rare. Everyone creates a spreadsheet that says we're going to do this. And then you look at it a while later and goes, where are all these customers? And so now you think, I'm one feature short of the product being a hit. So you want to add more features. But actually, you want to analyze exactly, to the extent it's possible, it's not so easy, what people are actually looking for. And you want to cut down on the number of things you're doing. So if you're thinking in your slide deck of all these different directions you're going to go, you like all things in your enterprise, you want to go, what are the most important things, the most valuable things to be working on, and not do anything else. And you should apply that to every domain. So when it comes to co-founders, when I see co-founders contracting on the side or doing this part-time, that's a big negative. You're in it together to make it a success. There are no side things that you're doing. When you're working on the product, oh, we're wondering about doing a B2B side. No, it's a B2C product, or it's a B2B product, but it's not both. Or we're going to launch in this country and this country, but you're not even launched here. Just focus on this. So once you have some sort of clarity of vision that I'm here and I wish to be here, of course, it's easier in retrospect to say that, but to avoid the noise of all the other things. And one of the noisy things, I think, for example, is blockchain, where, you know, in theory, I'm a huge fan of blockchain, but most of the times I see a pitch deck, we're doing a medical thing, something, dialysis, blockchain. And you just know that the company is going on a giant diversion, trying to find a developer who knows blockchain stuff, putting libraries in, all this stuff because of the perceived value. But actually, when an investor looks at it, they're probably going, you know, medical, technology, doctor, excellent blockchain. Sorry, why are we doing that again? Cutting out that stuff might actually be better. So honing in on the basics. And then I think the last thing from me is just about when it comes to getting investment, you need to figure out how to value your company. And very briefly, I think, there are a few different ways. So if you're going to raise some money, the investors are going to get a percentage of your company based on the amount they're investing and your valuation. So if they're going to invest £100,000 and they're going to get 10% of the business, this means your valuation will be not £1 million, but £900,000 before their investment. So after their investment, the business will be worth 900 plus the 100, £1 million, and they'll own 10% of it. So how do you come up with this £1 million valuation? And I think there are a few ways of doing it. You can read TechCrunch, and you can take a zero off the end, because those are crazy American valuations. You can read UK Tech News, where everyone says how much they've raised, but the problem is no one says what valuation it is. So that's not very useful. You can go to your accountant, who'll say, do you make any money? And you go, no. Do you lose money? You go, yes. Are you about to make money? No. And they're going to say, so remind me why your value is more than zero. So that's no good. Or you can run a spreadsheet model, as many companies I see do, which says that, year one, we're going to make this revenue, in year two, this, and year three, that. And the problem is, you know, I treat it as BS, and I think most professional investors treat it as BS as well, because no one hits those numbers. They're just made up numbers. And that's the problem with a lot of startups. One acts as if you've reached success. But actually, in the early stages of a startup, it's all about trying to understand what people really want and experimenting. And only once you have found that so-called product market fit can you now apply the laws of scaling to it. So the spreadsheet model doesn't really work either. So the model I've come up with, which is if you go to the SeedLegals Resources Deal Data section on our public website, is basically we've seen, using data over hundreds of funding rounds, people essentially sell or give away a median of 15% equity in a round. And that means it's actually quite simple, which is you simply multiply by 5 the amount of money you want to raise so that the equity the investor gets is 1 in 6, which is 16%, and that kind of reinforces what we see as the market average, or median, I should say. So that then takes us right back to the beginning, which is valuing your company, the ripples in the pond, and your goal each time is to raise 3 to 5 times as much money at 3 to 5 times the valuation to get to the next step. And to wrap up, you've really got 2 goals. Your real goal is to get a product that people love, that they'll use, tell their friends, and pay for. But to get there, you also have to raise investment or fund it yourself in order to get to that point. And if you can see those mechanics and the light at the end of the tunnel, then welcome to the world of being an entrepreneur. Thank you very much. I think I used to be with Kazaa, the music file sharing company, and you'd wake up in the morning and you'd look at the number of overnight downloads, and it's like, hypothetically like a drug, that you wake up in the morning, you go, 16 million people used our product overnight, or in iPlayer, it's like 2 million people. I mean, at SeedLegals, it's much smaller, but you look at the number of people doing rounds in one go. So for me, the high point, I think, too, is number one, I love going from an idea to something. Because ideas, there are endless numbers of them, but the formula, which is somewhat random, you can't predict it. How do you know what's good? But that going from something intangible to something that exists, I love. And I also love sort of the customer feedback and seeing people building their worlds based on what you've helped provide. I think that's really interesting because as a business develops, it becomes more and more scientific because you can use metrics and science to validate things. And as someone put it very nicely, if you think of a company, you might think of it as two parts, sort of a left and right brain. One of them is called startup, and the other one is called business. And business is something where you've got a known proposition. There are a certain number of users coming to your site, booking holidays. You know how much it costs you to acquire a user. You know how much you make revenue for each holiday booking. And so you can hire team members, and you know exactly what the formula is to grow your business. Startup, on the other hand, is experimental. You haven't proved anything. You've got this idea. And so startup is all about trialing lots of things. And there, I think, I don't think there's really particular science to it. It's having enough passion that I think you can initially act as the proxy for what people want, because there's a leap of faith, right? Before you've got some prototype you can test with people, you have to be enthused that this will work. And I think that's one of the exhilarating and sort of depressing often pieces of the journey, which is, you know, I look back at, I've read about the guy who invented the intermittent windscreen wiper, and he filed a patent on it. And I think he fought the car companies for 20 years on this stupid patent to get money for his intermittent windscreen wiper. How did he persevere for 20 years? You know, I've given up after 2 months, like, this is never going to work, dude. Move on with life. But somehow that sort of drug bit, and he continued on that. And eventually, I think he got some money just before he died. But yes, that initial piece is random, but there's something in you that's driving you on. I don't have a better answer. Yeah, that's a good point, because if you also happen to have sold a few startups, you know, your natural inclination of your investors or team members is like, dude, you planning to sell? So my answer is, when you start a business, your goal should never be to sell the business. It's to create a vibrant, growing business. But, you know, if you remember the early DOS prompts, it's kind of like ignore, retry, abort, retry, ignore. And I think as a founder, you're thinking this every day on your business. Do I do another funding round? Do I sell my business? Am I profitable so I don't need to do another funding round? Should I shut down my business? And in your mind at all times, these things should be playing out. And what is the right thing to do? So sometimes you're in the fortunate position of a business that's making revenue and growing. But many businesses, it takes a long time until you get revenue. So now you have to either fund the business yourself, which you can do when it's 2 people, but not really when it's 20 people, or raise more investment, or shut down the business, or sell the business. So it becomes opportunistic, and it depends. You know, you might be going, I'm looking to do a new funding round, but then an offer appears. And so my thought is, Your goal is always to create a vibrant, growing, sustainable, ongoing business, but you never know when the right opportunity comes along that makes it worthwhile taking that up. It's a good question. I think investors in the UK like to, they're a lot more risk averse than the US. I think the US is a lot more, we're going to change the world. You may lose huge amounts of money, so we'll give you huge amounts of money. It doesn't matter if you're losing money for a while, we'll take over the world. Whereas I think in UK, investors like to see that their money will, that your business will start becoming cash flow positive, if not after their investment, at least after the next one. And I think UK investors are not keen to see that their investment will get sunk and the next investment gets sunk before anything happens. And I think that's a key reason why you should not show on your slide deck that you are going to be building all of the stuff. Because the stuff to you, I mean, you read the Uber slide deck or those things, you know, the slide decks had raised $1 billion. This is a really bad thing to read. Because firstly, they're probably made up in retrospect. Secondly, you know, it's extremely exceptional. And thirdly, you know, it turns out those businesses have separate sets of problems by doing that. More realistically, if you have a slide deck that shows you doing lots of things, an investor looking at it will go, my money is going to get wasted on doing all of these things. At the end of it, you're going to have to get more money to ship these things, and then much better to go, my slide deck will show my investor that their money, after spending their money, I will have something that in a small way can generate users or revenue. And then I may get more money to scale it, but it shouldn't be sunk cost. And I think that's the difference between US and UK.